So a number of years ago, I was preparing to enter the Army. And as I was preparing, I was in regular contact with my Army recruiter. That's the guy who signed me up, facilitated lots and lots of paperwork so I could get into the Army. And he was asking me questions in terms of, what I might like to do in the Army, that sort of thing. And because I was going to go in as a infantryman, basically a soldier, that's like no real area of expertise. You're not a computer guy, you're not a mechanic, you're not a tuba player in a marching band, you're just a soldier, which is basically what I thought you were supposed to do when you join the Army. And because I was going to be a soldier, he asked me if I wanted to be a sky soldier, specifically if I wanted to be an airborne soldier, potentially in the 82nd Airborne. I didn't know what that was, so he proceeded to explain the vaunted unit history of the 82nd Airborne, from its glory days in World War II, all the way through the way that the unit served up through the Vietnam conflict, and its present day, this is 1982, present day status at the time, as the primary ready force if anything untoward would happen to the United States militarily. And everything that he said resonated with me, and I thought that would be pretty amazing. And given that I had only signed up for 2 years, it was about the most high-speed assignment that I would be eligible for if I were to choose to volunteer for it. So I said, how do I get into this unit? He said, don't worry. When you're going through basic training, they'll be asking for volunteers. They're beefing up the ranks at the 82nd at the present time. I said, okay, sounds good. So off I go to the Army, and I learned to do things the Army way and to become an Army person and so forth. And the weeks go by, and just like he said, a opportunity was given to volunteer for the 82nd Airborne, which would require that you volunteer for something called Airborne School, which is 3 weeks of training, which basically qualifies you to jump out of airplanes for the Army. And I wasn't sure if I was going to like that so much. I'd always struggled as a kid with a little bit of a fear of heights, and obviously airplanes fly way up in the air. But I was so compelled to be a part of this unit that I'd heard so much about. And of course, once I was in the Army, I heard even more. And some of my drill sergeants had served in the 82nd Airborne, and I was quite impressed with them. So I just thought it was a very honorable sounding place to end up. So I finish regular Army infantry training, and then off I go to jump school. 3 weeks for airborne school. Jump school to us cool guy insiders. And the first week was basically learning how to collide with the ground without breaking yourself. The second week was learning how to do that from slightly higher up in the air, to include things like being strapped into a parachute canopy and then lifted by an enormous crane 250 feet up in the air and then dropped, so you could actually practice sort of navigating your parachute canopy and then landing on the ground and so forth. So it was kind of cool. But it's a 3-week class, and the last week of class is called Jump Week, and all you do is jump. There are 5 scheduled jumps, modeling different sorts of circumstances and tasks. And the very end of the second week, called Tower Week, was Malfunctions class, which basically was a class to instruct you in all of the different ways that your parachute harness might conspire to try to kill you in the air, and how to potentially mitigate that before you collide with the ground and die. And that's where they sort of left things off. A sobering class it was. And it reminded me of the fact that I was more than a little bit uncomfortable with jumping out of airplanes, which was something that was going to be taking place in just a couple of days from that class. That class ended up on a Friday. We would be jumping our first jump that following Monday. I didn't sleep so well that weekend, Friday, Saturday, particularly Sunday night. I was very apprehensive about making my first jump, but at no point did I think about not jumping. At no point did I think about quitting, because I really wanted to be this person who was a proud member of the 82nd Airborne Division, and I couldn't be that guy unless I could get myself successfully through the remainder of airborne training and jump week. So Monday comes, and up into the plane we go, and short time later, out of the plane, I tumble, and I hit the ground, and it was a rough landing, but I survived, and off I went to, the next jump and then the next. Tuesday we had 2 jumps. Wednesday we had a night jump, and then Thursday is what they call a combat equipment jump, where you've got additional gear strapped to you so that you could figure out how to navigate all of that. And then you graduate after that final jump, and then Friday you out process and off you go to wherever it is that you're going to go. Now, the interesting thing about jump school is most of the people who went to jump school, when I went to jump school, were never going to jump again. They were going to jump school because it's kind of a prestige school to go to. And they were going to go back to their various units, and they were going to proudly display the little parachute-shaped badge with the wings on the side, but they were never going to jump again. Now, those of us who were going on to the 82nd Airborne Division, and then there were a few others who were going on to the Ranger Battalion or Special Forces training, we were going to be jumping a lot. And jumping in jump school was a very clinical affair. A few jumpers were put into the air at any given time, and then the plane would circle around, and a few more until the aircraft was empty. And then when all the aircrafts were empty, they would go and land. It's a very different type of process than the actual jumping that is done at the 82nd Airborne Division. So I did successfully graduate, and I was very happy about that, which meant that I immediately was eligible for a whole bunch of uniform upgrades that regular soldiers just don't get to wear. I'm not sure if some of those uniform upgrades were part of the motivation for doing this. I was just young and impressionable enough to fall sway to that, but I got to wear this cool maroon beret, unique to airborne troops, and I wouldn't have to wear those very plain dress shoes with my dress uniform anymore. I'd get to wear jump boots and tuck my pants into them, and stomp around like a real world commando, or so I thought. When I got to the 82nd Airborne Division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which was to be my home for the next couple of years, it wasn't too much longer than I was scheduled for my first jump. And I was told over and over that jumping in the 82nd Airborne was completely different than jumping in jump school. It was louder and bigger and crazier and scarier and in all of these things. And I was told this an awful lot. And it's not like I needed additional reasons to feel uncomfortable or apprehensive about jumping. I still had plenty of those. My 5 jumps in jump school got me through jump school, but they did not get me any closer to being comfortable with jumping. And it was February-ish of 1983 that I was preparing for my very first jump in the 82nd, something called a mass tactical jump, which means that about a brigade's worth of soldiers were going to be in the air. A few thousand bodies in the air. If you've ever seen film of this, you can look it up on YouTube. There's many planes in formation, and then all of a sudden those planes all start discharging lots and lots of bodies, all strapped to parachutes, and you see these parachutes just pop, 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 pop on either side of each aircraft, and there's maybe 6 or 8 aircraft, and it's just like this blanket of humanity coming down under these nylon parachutes and then covering the ground. And it's indeed very chaotic and scary, because you're so close to each other in the air that if you bounce off of each other, your parachute can collapse. And if that happens, you've got maybe a couple of seconds to deploy your reserve. And if you don't deploy in time, you'll die, because they would drop you so low to the ground, which mimics combat conditions, because you don't want to spend excess amount of time in the air. That happened during World War II, and a lot of Nazis shot a lot of American paratroopers basically before they even hit the ground. They were just sort of stuck in their parachute, swaying in the breeze, an attractive target to an adversary. So here's where I started experiencing a lack of congruence in my life. Congruence basically being who you say you are, when words and deeds and thoughts all align. And when we're out of congruence, Well, we just don't get as far as fast as when we are in congruence. When we're certainly not as happy when we are when we're out of congruence rather than in. And I was feeling very incongruent in those days because on the outside, I had the exterior, I had the accoutrements, the uniform. I looked like a rough, tough 82nd Airborne paratrooper, and I could pull off the look and all of that. But on the inside, I didn't feel like it, and the reason I didn't feel like it is because I was still a little bit scared of jumping. Now, it never occurred to me in those days to ask if anybody else was, because I probably would have been surprised by the answer in those days. But none of us talked about it. Those of us who were a little apprehensive about jumping, we never mentioned it to one another because it's just the sort of thing that wasn't done. You don't admit weakness. You just, you make that stern face and you move on. So I was good at the stern face, but I really felt sort of out of touch or disconnected from who I was supposed to be. There was something inherently dishonest feeling about being scared to jump, because jumping was sort of the definitive characteristic of a paratrooper. So I survived that first mass TAC, as we called them, and those jumps were so dangerous, and they don't even do them like that now because they were so dangerous. That first jump was a 700-foot drop. You really don't have any time to react. If you have a parachute malfunction, you're probably going to die. There's just, the lack of height robs you of reaction time. So nowadays, I don't think they drop anybody, at less than 1,000 feet in those circumstances, or it may be some other number. I'm a little out of touch with current practices. But in those days, they were experimenting with just how low they could get us to the ground, just so that we could get accustomed to that very brief drop and getting on the ground and getting underway quickly. So I had a lot of time between that jump and then my next jump. And with each week that would go by, I would just experience that dread of knowing that I was going to jump eventually, and I was going to be scared when I jumped, and I didn't like that feeling, A, because nobody likes that feeling, and B, I didn't like that feeling because it made me feel a bit like a fraud. I didn't feel like a real paratrooper. I didn't feel like I truly belonged because there was this incongruence. I was like this on the outside, but on the inside, I was not right there. So I don't exactly know how it happened. It was May, my next jump, May of 1983, and it was a night jump. And drop time was going to be at 12 midnight. And other than that, it wasn't a large-scale jump. It was kind of a medium-sized jump, but it was a combat equipment jump. We would be all strapped into our gear and our weapons and all of that stuff. So you have to kind of tinker with that while you're in the air so that you're not having it all completely attached to you when you land, because otherwise, you're going to break limbs. So there's a way that you release your rucksack, and it kind of drops down about 15 feet on this little retention line, and your rifle is in a canvas case that's padded, but you loosen part of it so that it can kind of move separate from your body, so that when you tumble across the ground when you land, you're not sort of splinted to it and having some injuries that way. But I decided that I needed to do something, and I wasn't really sure how to go about it. It was just sort of the force of will that I learned to muster in my early days in the Army. And I decided that whatever it took, I was not going to act scared. Now, I don't think that I had externally ever acted scared of jumping. I would just get very quiet and very serious, like everyone else would do, and we all sort of looked the same as we did what we did. But in this instance, I decided that I'm going to try to be as enthusiastic as I possibly can. Now, I was going to be acting enthusiastic, and that didn't seem dishonest because I was already sort of being dishonest because I was afraid. I was just going to not act afraid. I was going to try to come up with the most opposite means of manifesting non-fear that I could. So I was going to try to be a little more jocular. I was going to, kind of amp myself up. I was going to try to act as though I like to jump. That's it. I was going to tell myself that I like to jump. I was going to act as though I like to jump. And so I carried that through. It was late at night when we loaded up in the trucks to head down to what we call Green Ramp, which was the neighboring Pope Air Force Base, which is where we would get our chutes. We'd strap in, we'd get everything inspected, and then we'd kind of march across the tarmac into the back end of a C-130 transport aircraft and await further instructions, which basically meant stand up and jump out those doors at the appropriate time. So, but this entire time, these several hours that process normally took, I was doing my very best to act like, hey, I like this. Yeah, I can't wait to jump. This is going to be a good jump. Oh, it's going to be a full moon tonight? Yeah, that'll be good. I like jumping in a full moon. I'd never jumped in the full moon before, but it's like literally everything that I learned about the jump as information was forthcoming, I decided that was the best possible news I could hear. I was doing this completely unprompted, without any benefit of book or research or anything that suggested that this would be a good idea or even a bad idea. I just had this idea and I was going to run its course. So we're on the plane, we're all geared up, we're hooking onto the cable that deploys the chute once you dive out the door, and the doors are open. I literally can see the full moon out the doors of the aircraft, and it dawns on me, that looks kind of cool. The moon was so bright, I could literally see the ground, which is not a luxury you normally have during a night jump. You and the ground sort of collide at the last second. You had no idea where it was because dark. So it's a bright night. Winds are very minimal, which is always a good thing when you're jumping. And whether it was real good news or I was just convincing myself that this was all good news, I was treating all news as good news. So it's about time to go out the door. You got the little lights that go, and that light turns green, and bodies start popping out, and out I go. There's that initial sort of whoosh of wind and chaos, and you're sort of twisting around, and it's loud, and you're disoriented because you're spinning a bit, and then you sort of stop because your chute is deployed, and you kind of untangle a little bit with your harness material, and then you can kind of take a look. Is there a canopy above you? Is there something preventing you from hurtling towards the earth? In my case, yes, there was, and that was obviously good news. And from there on out, I just decided that I was going to enjoy the ride. Now, my heart is pounding. There's all of that. I didn't just magically make that disappear. I was just choosing to engage with it in a way that was fundamentally different than I had on previous jumps, which there weren't that many at that point. And next thing you know, you're on the ground, boom, you hit hard because you always do, and suddenly it's over. And I just knew that something had been different. Couldn't articulate it at the time, young and not that much perspective so much. And I'm not even sure I really would have been able to define it had there been words. But I knew that something was different. And I made a decision as we trucked back to where we were heading, that I was going to seek out every opportunity to jump, because every now and then there would be unscheduled opportunities for jump where like another unit would be jumping, they would have a couple of extra chutes, and they would be looking for volunteers, something that they called strap hangers in those days. And I decided that despite the fact I'm still a little apprehensive, I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to volunteer for every possible jump I can. And over the course of the summer of 1983, I got on a lot of jumps, every single jump I possibly could. And by, I would say, July, 2 months later, after this conscious decision that I had made, that I'm going to act as though I like jumping, in about 2 months' time, I actually, honestly, could say that I liked jumping. And that was an amazing feeling, not just because, it felt good, whatever that might mean, but moreover, it was a good feeling because I finally felt like me. I felt complete. I didn't feel dishonest. Who I was on the outside, whether, it was the haircut or the expression, the uniform, which said certain things about who I was, finally all matched up with the person on the inside. It was in the Army that I learned about the importance of congruence. And it was in the Army that I made the decision that I was going to create congruence within myself. I was going to create it for myself. And in the intervening years, with all the different things that I've done, I've always fought very hard to make sure that whatever I look like on the outside, whatever I'm saying to the world with my words, all matches how I think, and I try to make all of the things that I think match up with how I act. I do my best to be as consistent as I can. And of course, I fall short with that. We all do. But I always make the earnest effort for things to match. And things matching, that's congruence. And when things match, at least for me, and I believe this will be true for you, and maybe it already has been true for you, that when those things match, that's when you do your best work. Not just in terms of that's when you'll get the most accomplished, but I think that's when you will feel the most accomplished. Congruence, being the same on the inside as well as the outside. I recommend it. I recommend never doing anything else.